Let's go to New York slash Florida. Talk about this character, Edward Anthony Carfano, little paisano they call him. He met his end on Friday, September 25, 1959, around almost 11 o'clock at night. They found him on a beautiful tree-lined street in Jackson Heights in Queens. The woman killed with him. He was murdered with a beautiful blonde. She was 32-year-old Janice Drake. She's about half his age. She was married. It was a double homicide, and it shocked the nation. It was in the papers for days and days. Carfano was arrested for the first time in Mount Vernon in Westchester for felonious assault with a gun. He was 21 years old. The case was discharged, no conviction. It happened again and again with him. It was the first of 11 charges he'd received over his lifetime, ranging from vagrancy to murder. But, 11 arrests for a guy that spent 5 decades in crime, not bad. In his late 20s, Carfano became a part of a crew that was run by Frankie Yale, based in Boston. Yale graduated from the Five Points game between 1910 and 1917. Yale, was arrested 7 times. He served 2 prison sentences. The empire Yale built before the Capones killed him, was extensive. And he was a powerful guy. Serving under Yale at one time or another were the Mangano brothers, as an example. They'd build their own operation that would eventually, with time, become the Gambino crime family. It was Johnny Silk Stocking, Gusta, Tullio, Craterface, listen to these names, Piccone, Anthony, Tony Springs, Romeo, Jimmy Napoli, Frank and Ralph Capone, Alphonse Napoli, Crazy Benny Pazzo, Frank Nitti, who was then known as Frank Nitto. I always doubted that was true, but it was. I looked it up. Willie Altieri, Jack Stick'em Up Stabell, Frenchie Collins, Carlino, Johnny Beth, Odo. Who else have we got here? And that's it. We also had Joe Adonis and Frank Costello working for him at one point. Carafano was married to Lillian DeSalvio. They had a son, Francis Anthony. He was born 1921. Lillian's father was a Tammany Hall election captain in the 2nd Assembly District West. He was Tammany Hall, I know a lot of younger people know, was a political organization in New York, was dominated by the Irish, but they were smart enough, excuse me, to spread the wealth and the power. So he was an Italian captain in a heavily Italian neighborhood, and he turned out to vote for him. And there weren't many like his kind. They would come later, but at the time, so it made him a pretty powerful guy. He was also owner of a successful Greenwich Village nightclub. It's a bar called Jimmy Kelly's. It's an infamous bar at 181 Sullivan Street. It opened in 1921. The same year, in August, Carfano, Joseph Pastori, and John Shortina were arrested by the superintendent of police of Saratoga Springs, way upstate New York, for picking pockets of patrons. Say that one quickly. Of the Hudson Valley Trolley Company. They were fined $50 and kicked out of town. So these trolleys were crowded, and they'd go in and bump into somebody and grab their wallet. But I guess they weren't that slick. They got caught. On August 13th, 1925, Carfano was arrested with Tommy O'Neill in connection with a break-in at Newman's Lake House on Lake Lonely near Saratoga Springs. Never heard of it. During the burglary, night watchman Charlie Cook was shot and wounded. The investigation of that thing dragged on for almost a year, and in June of 1926, charges against Carfano were dismissed. There was no evidence. They just couldn't prove it, but they knew he did it. In the meantime, Yale's feud with Capone over in Chicago was getting worse and worse for Yale. One summer's night, he was returning from the Harvard Inn, the infamous Harvard Inn, around where Capone used to work. And Rica, I think, Torrio had something to do. I can't remember at the moment. He was going on about 3 in the morning. Yale's car was attacked 3 blocks from the Bath Beach police station on Cropsey Avenue. They shot up the car pretty good. 200 shots from a .45 caliber pistol. The passenger, Rocco Lawrence, and Yale's brother Angelo, who was driving, were injured. Yale and Carfano, along with the other rider, member of Yale's gang, B.B. Kinsell, escaped completely unharmed, which is miraculous. On Sunday, July 1st, 1928, Yale was drinking at the bar, the Sunrise Club. He owned it, on 14th and 65th Street. Around 4 p.m., he got a call telling his wife, Lucinda, had been taken ill, and he needed to get to the house as quickly as possible. So Yale, who was a very careful man, he left for some reason without the speakeasy, without his driver and his bodyguard, Jim Capone. So while he's driving his new brown Lincoln Town Car along 44th Street in the Homewood section of Brooklyn, he was overtaken by a black Buick sedan, which had crowded him, pushed him into the curb, into a wall. They fired a dozen shots into Yale's car. It crashed off the road, narrowly missed a tree, and demolished a brick wall outside the home of the Solomons. Solomon and Bertha Kaufman, I should say. I'm sorry, Solomon and Bertha Kaufman, who were celebrating inside their son's bar mitzvah. Although Yale's murder became famous for the alleged first mob killing in New York involving a Thompson submachine gun, he was in fact killed by pistol bullets and shotgun pellets, according to the autopsy, and he was shot a lot. Although he was driving a newly purchased bulletproof car, he had the window rolled down on the driver's side, and so they got him through the window. This was the fifth and final attempt at killing him, beginning the first one being in February 6, 1921. Frankie Yale's funeral on July 5th, which Carfano organized, was his gangster extravaganza. It was the first of many big gangster extravaganza funerals. There was between 24 and 38 cars in the procession, just to carry the flowers now. One of those sets of flowers was this enormous display that showed a clock on the hands at 4:10. It's the time he had died. That's a bit on the dramatic side, isn't it? Aside from the flower car, there were maybe some newspaper people said 200 other cars in the procession. The count varied by newspaper. One place had it at 250. The hearse that carried the coffin, Yale, was buried in a nickel, and listen to this, nickel and silver plated coffin. Can you imagine? It cost $15,000 then. Good night. As the funeral party drove from the Church of St. Rosalia in Borough Park to the Holy Cross Cemetery in Flatbush, it passed through an Italian colony between Borough Park and Bath Beach, which, out of respect, was closed. I don't know about this. Out of respect, was closed for Yale. I think it was closed because Carfano went there and told him, "You're closing, by the way." Stores were closed, flags were at half-mast. 1,000 people lined the streets. Again, people, everybody would line it. I mean, they just look at a gangster funeral, and there's a lot to look at here. This thing is massive. There's a huge flower thing, so it wasn't like they were sorry the poor bastard died or something. A little bit more drama was added when two women, both claimed to be Yale's wife, physically had a fist fight over control of the coffin. A reported 112 men lined the grave, each holding a red rose. These, I assume, were mafioso, and they were thrown into as the gravedigger shoveled the earth back into the ground. Maybe. Carfano accompanied Yale's second wife to the funeral. Yale's first wife, Maria, and her two daughters were broke. She had to take a job in a sweatshop as a seamstress to support the girls. There was no money for her. He didn't give her anything. The second wife was left with $3,000 after the estate was liquidated, but before lawyers' fees and taxes. So, what'd she get? $1,500 maybe? Yale had operated several legitimate businesses in Brooklyn: a funeral home, a number of laundries, a restaurant, a taxi business, the Harvard Inn, he had that, a saloon, a company that manufactured cigars, a company that created boxes for cigars as well. He also peddled narcotics, a lot of money in that. He ran bootleg booze, and he managed extortion rings, mainly within the laundry industry. The millions of dollars Yale held in various businesses vanished. Most of it probably floated into Carfano's pockets. Carfano took over Yale's business interest, and he shared them with Joe Pravacci, a very young Joe Pravacci. The two men hailed from Villabete near Palermo, Sicily, and they were friends for a long time. After the burial, Carfano and 5 of his playmates were stopped by a squad of New York City detectives led by the infamous Johnny Broderick. The cops claimed the hoods had run a red light, whatever it was. Then they dragged him out of the car, took him to the police station, and held him for 12 hours. Just why not? They felt like it. Broderick was a fearsome cop. His squad, the so-called industrial squad, they kept an eye on the Broadway theater district. It was a great source of income for the city, uh, and the publicity for the city. You know, people would come from all over the world once to see the shows. Well, and it still does. The theater district brings in money for the city. But they were also so they covered that, but they were also in charge of policing labor strikes. When I say, by the way, they kept an eye on the Broadway district, their job was basically this: we don't want no trouble in the Broadway. I don't care what it is. Everything there is peaceful and calm and lovely, and that's how they put down the law too. The squad was best known in the underworld for the beatings they doled out. Two of the recipients of Broderick's fists were Jack Legs Diamond. Legs had made the stupid mistake of threatening Broderick, so Broderick emptied a trash can over his head and then forced him to crawl away with the trash can on. Two Gun Crowley, who was, he was more of a mentally disturbed person than anything else. He wanted to fight it out with Broderick, and Broderick knocked him out with a single punch. Crowley had pointed a gun at Broderick, which was probably a stupid thing to do. Broderick demanded that the hoods tip their hat to him. And once he went to a gangster funeral to keep an eye on the crowd when a member of the Hudson Dusters gang spat in his eye. He paid later on. He tossed hoodlums who had been bothering women through a plate, this is down in Broadway again, through a plate glass window one by one, and then arrested them for malicious destruction of property, for which they were sentenced, by the way, 30 days in jail. He disarmed a man who was robbing a crowded restaurant on Columbus Circle with guns and knives. He did it with his bare hands. He didn't have anything to defend him with. He took the guns, he took the knives, he arrested the guy. Broderick's weapon of choice was a hammer wrapped in a newspaper. So to the public, it looks like the gangsters were just being slapped with a newspaper or hit on the head with a newspaper, not with a hammer. His beatings were indiscriminate. He once beat a prisoner in his custody so badly that he was crippled for life. He and his squad sometimes beat up innocent citizens as well, yet brutality complaints against him were useless because Broderick was a celebrity. He was also politically tied into Tammany Hall, but he was a celebrity, and the newspaper people didn't want to hear it because he provided inside information. He was a good story cover. Gossip columnists, beat reporters loved this guy. They mentioned him. It was that, and his ties to Tammany, of course. A character based on Broderick was the subject of a 1936 film, Bullets or Ballots, with Broderick character played by Edward G. Robinson, of course. Then there were questions about his method. On November 3, 1926, this gangster, Hyman Amberg of the Amberg brothers, he led an escape from jail, but it was Broderick who stopped the escape. He faced down two armed convicts, Amberg being one of them, after they had killed two prison officials. The official story was that the two convicts, who were already badly wounded, committed suicide as Broderick approached them. I'd really like to know what happened there, didn't you? He was not above selling his badge, and his ability to throw a punch, he sold that as an informal protection service for crime victims, especially young women. If a guy was bothering a young woman, an ex-husband, an old boyfriend, he'd go over there and beat the guy senseless, and then he'd go back to the woman and say, okay, that'll be $100. I trust you, he won't be back. The industrial squad that he was on, the industrial squad, was remarkably corrupt. The mayor, Fluelio LaGuardia, accused the squad of extorting payments from labor and management, and he was right. So he'd go to one side or the other and collect a few bucks, and then give the side who paid the most, give them the favor of winning the battle, whatever it was of the day. The Furriers Union had a guy named Isidore Shapiro. He told the Special Committee of the American Federation of Labor that his union paid the police $3,800 a week in bribes for protection during a strike in 1926. Union officials claimed that the non-union workers were beaten up while police officers, quote, stood idly by. Shapiro claimed that the industrial squad chief, meaning Broderick, was paid $100 a week, and that the 10 men in his squad were paid $50 each. In July of 1926, Broderick and the industrial squad were accused by the American Civil Liberties Union of clubbing and beating striking transit workers and injuring 20. anyway, the squad was accused by the Teamsters beating and striking drivers. That was a big thing, when they went the transit workers. It was a battle in the streets of New York. It was really an awesome fight between these two. In 1939, the communist leader Maurice Malkin told the House Un-American Committee that the Furriers Union, which was controlled by communists until the 20s, borrowed 1.75 million from Arnold Rothstein to finance the 1926 strike, and that 110,000 went directly to Broderick. They handed him the money. And it also went to his partner, Broderick's partner, a guy named Barney Rudinsky, who was legendary. Anyway, Carfano started clearing house the same day that Frankie Yale was placed in his grave. On October 26, 1928, Michel Abertamarco, a.k.a. Mike Schwartz, or Schatz, who was a close aide, actually, to Yale. He was a major player in the bootlegging business. He left a card game in a coffee shop at Union Street and 4th Avenue in Bath Beach sometime around 3 o'clock, and he was shot dead in his car on 83rd Street near 24th in Brooklyn, 3 times in the head, 1 in the chest. A good professional hit. A pedestrian, Jack Simon, claimed that he'd seen a man get out of the car after hearing the shots. The man walked away through the darkness of a vacant lot. Police discovered a recently fired handgun in the weeds near the lot. Carfano was a major suspect in the killing, but instead, 4 months later, the police arrested Ralph Sprizza, a.k.a. Captain Moon, of Carroll Gardens, a member of the newly formed Profaci family, in connection with the hit, since there was some evidence that he may have left the card game with the victim. It didn't matter. Charges were dropped. Nobody did any time on that. In June, Carfano was arrested in connection with the murder of Gandolfo Corto, a.k.a. Frankie Marlowe, who was shot dead in the Queens. Police interrogated Carfano for 3 hours. The cops had a theory that Corto had borrowed 40 grand from Yale, and when Yale was killed, he thought, well, this is great. But Carfano showed up to collect, and he refused his face. I don't owe it to you. I borrowed it from Yale. Go away. So Marlowe went out to dinner on a Monday night, 252 52nd Street, Manhattan, called La Tavernelle. The owner was Ignacio Copo and 4 others. Marlowe had gone to the track early in the day, and he joined his group, the 4 other guys at the table. After about an hour, Marlowe made a phone call, and then he returned to the table. He told the party he had to leave, and as he walked towards Broadway, one of his dinner guests, a dancer at the club, Mary Cedar, known as Mickey of the Rendezvous. Wow. A blue sedan with 2 men inside stopped, and they picked him up. But only him. They left the girl there. His body was found 45 minutes later on the roadside at the opposite entrance to the Flushing Cemetery in Queens. 3 shots fired, 2 in the head, 1 in the jaw, 1 in the neck, rather. He had $16 in his pockets. He left debts of around $250,000. Carfano, of course, was hauled in, but he was released. When Giuseppe Massari was murdered in Coney Island, at a restaurant in Coney Island in April 1931, Carfano had been inside the building a few hours before the murder. He was seen by a businessman, an successful Brooklyn undertaker, and he had been summoned to make payments in an extortion scam going back to the Frankie Yale days. On February 13th, and he was paying Carfano in his stead. On February 13th, 1931, police raided Carfano's office on Union Street. It was above a barber shop. He wasn't there. The police were clamping down as what they saw a potential mob war between Carfano's group and a group led by Johnny Bath Beach Odo. Odo had once been with Frankie Yale, but when Yale was killed, he moved over to work with Joe Profaci. Odo was the name of a character in a movie, and he played the bad guy Odo, Johnny Odo. I'm almost positive that was the name. And the Gallo brothers used to go and watch it, and they knew the lines, and they'd say the lines out loud. I'm pretty sure it was Odo. Anyway, on March 5, 1931, around 5 o'clock, Carfano was believed to have been in a wild shootout with Union City, New Jersey police. Police spotted this car going the wrong way down a one-way street, and they found out the car had been used in a robbery of a local garage a few hours before. They stole 20 bales of silk worth 40 grand. In the shootout, a patrolman was murdered. Anthony Curto, who was in the car, identified Carfano as one of the killers. But Curto couldn't pick him out in a lineup. He had a sudden change of heart. And again, charges were dropped. In 1931, Carfano was dragged in for questioning his role of a particularly brutal, bloody triple murder in a Brooklyn speakeasy. On October 1931, Billy Price and Edward Flanagan were stabbed, strangled, found wrapped in potato sacks, and stuffed into the backseat of a car and left in Borough Park. The two probably worked for Vannie Higgins, and they were part of this growing body count in a war between Carfano and Higgins. Higgins was a bootlegger from Bay Ridge, an Irish bootlegger. He was referred to as the last Irish crime boss. I don't think that's true. The cops pulled in Carfano and questioned him, which became just this exercise in stupid. I mean, he always walked. I don't know. So they pulled him in at this point, just based on principle. On Sunday, September 11th, 1932, Gerardo Scarpato, who was the owner of the restaurant where Giuseppe Massari was shot dead, was found behind the front seats of an abandoned car in Brooklyn. His corpse had been stuffed into, again, like a sack, a sort of potato sack, a bag. He'd been strangled. He was last seen with a man named James DiMino, and they were walking toward Carfano's office because he had an appointment there. Well, that was the end of him. On September 20th, three men walked into a bar where Edward Red Patterson had been drinking, and they started shooting. They severely wounded Patterson and accidentally killed his bartender, Fred Gillis. Patterson had been trying to muscle in on Carfano's rackets because he figured Carfano's wrapped up in this thing with Higgins. I'll just take what's on the fringes. Well, that didn't work. So although he escaped that barroom shooting, he was murdered a little while later. He was beaten severely, and he was shot 4 times, dumped in the doorway of a house near the Brooklyn Bridge, in the shadow of the Brooklyn Bridge. A year later, August 7th, 1934, 2 men. You see what I'm saying, by the way? This guy's got 11 arrests. I mean, in his life. I mean, anyway, a year later, August 7, 1934, 2 men, Vincent Paisano and Oreste Di Robertis, 29, were shot dead while sleeping in their lodging house. It was a boarding house at 704 President Street in Brooklyn. Talk about the Gallows. The Gallo brothers. The men had been trying to muscle in on a policy racket that Carfano was operating there. It was operated by a relative of his. And they just figured, well, we'll just take it. Well, then on November 1, the New York City Police Commissioner released a booklet containing photos. This is a new big deal. Chicago did the same thing, a photo and descriptions. This time it named the Big 9 gang leaders. It went out to all the precincts with orders to harass these guys in this book, pick them up for whatever reason you want, and hold them for however long you want. So Anthony Carfano was number 9 in the book. By 1938, the FBI had identified Carfano as the owner of the Continental Club in Miami, which opened on January 25th of that year. So he was slowly moving into Florida, getting out of New York and moving down to Florida. A lot of gangsters were. Mo Dallas was moving down there, had interest in there. Lansky. One of his 11 arrests happened down there in 1933 in Miami. He was found guilty of carrying a concealed weapon. He was fined $100. He was a silent partner in the Frolics Club on 13th Street, Miami, with Mo Dalitz. And in 1939, he was part of an investment group that included Frank Erickson, a big-time gambler, in taking over the Woodford Hotel at 2401 Collins Avenue. Carfano was listed as the hotel's chief executive. This guy didn't get out of elementary school, so that's pretty darn good. In 1943, the mafia boss of Cleveland, Al Pelosi, he retired. He moved to Florida, and him with Tatum Woodford, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and Carfano, they opened the Sands Grand Hotel in Miami Beach. It's a beautiful, beautiful building. Supposedly, this was the in retreat for all of mobdom in the winter, and in the back was a casino, which was thought to be the largest in the American South. Over the next 20 years, Carfano developed a network that It had overlapping interests, legitimate, illegitimate businesses. He did business with Lansky, mafia boss Santo Trafficante, Costello, of course, and they had them all over Florida. By the late 40s, Miami was definitely Carfano's home. He lived there full time. Alan Drake, he was born Alan Margolis, he was Jewish, grew up in Boston in the West End. In the early 20s, he moved to Florida and he started to work as a cab driver for Siegel Safety Cabs in Miami. And on the weekends, he'd fight as a boxer, amateur boxer, a prize fighter, not for money. One night, he happened to pick up Carfano as a fare, and the two of them became friends. They liked each other immediately. Carfano hired Drake as his driver, gopher, that sort of thing. And in the meantime, Drake tried to break into show business as a stand-up comic. He really was a good comic. I've seen him on TV when I was a boy or very young. In 1944, Drake met his future wife, 18-year-old Janice Hansen from Waukegan. While Weehawken, I'm sorry, from Weehawken, he was the MC of a beauty show she had won. They had a son, and they were close to Caifano, his wife, who plays like this fatherly figure towards them. And I mention that because later on it was implied there was an affair going on. Nobody knows that. In the late 1940s, Vito Genovese returned to the U.S. from Italy. He decided he's going to challenge Frank Costello. He wants to run the mob. So in May of 1957, Costello survives an assassination attempt organized by Genovese. Costello surrendered. He had more than all the money he would ever need. He surrendered to Genovese. He told his Capagenes they should surrender too and accept Genovese as their new boss. Most of them did, and they did it reluctantly. The difference was Costello was a bit lofty. I've told you that story in the past when he was dying, his last day on Earth. They were going to take him to one hospital very close to his home. And he said, no, absolutely not. I need to go across town to this other hospital, which, when he was a young man, was where the WASP, the rich and famous, went to die. It was that sort of thing. He was seeing a psychiatrist. He wanted to get his life straightened out. He hung around with people from the upper world. He didn't like being this gangster boss guy. It brought him power, but he wanted a different life. On the other hand, you got Genovese as a working class guy, and he was really popular with all the crews, the guys on the street. They liked Genovese. Genovese would go, he'd rub shoulders with them, he was part of them. Costello was distant in a way. So anyway, he told his capos, look, surrender, and as I say, most did, some didn't. One guy didn't, Willie Moretti, he was murdered in 1951. Carfano didn't accept Genovese, and he didn't accept his leadership, he didn't like him. So he flew to New York to show his support for Costello. And while he's in New York, he didn't bother to meet with Genovese, who was now his boss. So that was a blatant sign of disrespect, and it had to be addressed. You can't have any organization that big with that type of element where you just can't have that sort of thing go unaddressed. So there were other reasons. Genovese, he ordered his right-hand man, Tony Bendestrollo, to murder Carfano. It's that simple. The other reason was greed. Carfano, he's produced millions. His rackets, they're just millions and millions of dollars coming in. He put in 14-hour days. This guy had money just pouring out of, and they wanted it. It's that simple. There is another story. I don't put a lot of heat in it. Carfano was making his way into Havana, but and Genovese had protected rackets there and all that stuff. But the 1950, actually after 57, the writing about Havana was on the wall. People it was going to fall. There was no question Havana was going to fall. The leadership of the Cuban government was all coked up. Did you know that? Yeah. They were all coked up. They were just showing up to work, getting a check and going home. The place was a mess. And Las Vegas was starting to pop. In Las Vegas, the state passed a law that said if you have a casino here, you can't have a casino anywhere else. And people looked, and like Meyer Lansky said, you can't make no money off the backs of the Cuban people. And it was a seasonal thing. it's hot as hell in the summer, and so just a few months, they'd make all their money. Las Vegas completely different. I mean, it's near L.A., Texas. So anyway, I don't know if that's true, but on the night of September 25, 1959, Strollo, who I said had been assigned to kill Carfano, he invited Carfano to dinner at Marino's restaurant. Carfano said sure, he'd meet Strollo, but he wanted to go to the Copacabana for a few hours and relax, and they'd meet him for a late dinner. So Carfano went, but he ran into some mutual friends at the bar, including Janice Drake, the wife of Alan Drake. Remember him? And he took him to Marino's for dinner. Carfano offered to drive Janice home after supper to her apartment in Rego Bar, Queens, where, as I said, her 13-year-old boy was sleeping. In the middle of the meal, Carfano gets a call. He goes, in those days you had to get up and go to a phone. Leaves the table, gets the phone, comes back. It was probably, the theory is, Frank Costello telling him, look, I just found out Genovese is going to kill you. You're not going to leave New York, so what you ought to do is get the hell out of here. So Carfano returned to the table. After the call, he told his dinner companions, we have to go. I'm going to drop her off at her house, and nice seeing you all, and so forth. He said it was urgent business, and he needed to get back to, I'm assuming he needed to get back to Miami, is what he said, but we don't know. Carfano and Drake left the restaurant, and so somewhere along the line, some reporters said they were headed for LaGuardia Airport in Queens. LaGuardia was the place to be, the airport at the time. But he was going to get a flight to Miami and blah, blah, blah. I don't know. The world was a different place. You couldn't just hop on a plane at 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night in those days. There weren't as many as there are now. And there's no source they were going to. Why would he do that? I think if they were doing that, I think that the theory was, well, the two of them were going to take off and live happily ever after together. I don't think so. I think that in fact, they were going to the airport, she was probably going to drive him, drop him off, and go home, and he'd go back to Miami. Nobody really knows what happened next. Some theorize that Strollo may have planted a gunman in the backseat of the caddy. I don't know. I mean, a guy like Carfano, he's going to be aware of that. So, anyway, at 10:30 at night, 45 minutes after they left the restaurant, their bodies were found in Carfano's car near the airport. Both had been shot in the head, dead.